In 1989, a young black man named James Ellis was arrested for a brutal crime he didn't commit. The evidence was weak, the witnesses unreliable, and the justice system flawed, but none of that stopped the court from sentencing him to life in prison. He was just 22 years old. For 3 decades, James sat behind bars in a maximum security prison, holding on to one thing no cell could take away, the truth. And then one letter changed everything. Part 1. The crime and arrest. It was a humid summer night in July 1989, when the unthinkable happened in the quiet suburb of Fairview, Georgia. A young woman named Rebecca Coleman was found unconscious and badly beaten in a local park. She had been left for dead near a jogging trail, her clothes torn, and her face bloodied beyond recognition. A frantic call to 911 from a dog walker brought police and paramedics rushing to the scene. Rebecca was rushed to the hospital, clinging to life. In the chaos of the crime scene, a single scrap of paper was found near the victim, a torn-up receipt from a corner store about a mile away. It had a timestamp of 8:47 p.m., just minutes before the estimated time of the attack. Surveillance footage from the store was grainy, but it showed a young black man purchasing a soda and a pack of gum. That image, though unclear, would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. By the next morning, James Ellis, a 22-year-old warehouse worker who lived 2 blocks from the park, was taken into custody. James had no criminal record. He'd grown up in Fairview, gone to local schools, and was known as quiet, polite, and hardworking. But he matched the rough description from the store footage, and that was enough for police eager to show they were making progress. During interrogation, James maintained his innocence. He said he had been at home watching TV with his younger sister, but when police interviewed her, they claimed her answers were vague and inconsistent. James was held for questioning for nearly 16 hours, during which he was offered no food, no attorney, and minimal sleep. Eventually, under pressure and exhaustion, James signed a vague statement saying he might have seen something in the park. A statement the detectives twisted to suggest admission. By the end of the week, James Ellis was formally charged with assault, attempted murder, and sexual battery. His face was plastered across newspapers and television. Reporters dubbed him the Fairview Monster. Protests erupted both for and against him. James's world and his family's crumbled overnight. But the nightmare was only just beginning. Part 2, Trial and Conviction. James's trial began in the spring of 1990, less than a year after his arrest. From the start, it was clear the odds were stacked against him. The prosecution leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence, that grainy convenience store footage, the torn receipt, and James's coerced statement. They painted a narrative of a young man with a short temper who had allegedly lashed out in a moment of rage. There were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence. Rebecca, still recovering from a coma, had no memory of the attack and could not identify James, but the climate in the courtroom was charged. The media's portrayal of James as the Fairview Monster had poisoned public opinion. Jurors came in already skeptical, and the prosecution exploited every racial stereotype they could. James's public defender, Carl Whitmore, was overworked and under-resourced. He had taken on 27 cases that month alone and had little time to properly investigate or prepare a defense. Carl attempted to introduce James as alibi, that he was at home with his sister, but under cross-examination, the prosecution portrayed the sister as unreliable and possibly lying to protect her brother. One of the prosecution, a so-called key witnesses, was a park maintenance worker who claimed to have seen a man who looked like James near the crime scene. When questioned, the man admitted it was dark, and he saw the person from across a parking lot, but the damage was done. His uncertain testimony became one of the prosecution's highlights. The most damning moment came when prosecutors read James's vague statement aloud in court. Though it did not confess to the crime, they portrayed it as an indirect admission. The judge overruled objections about how the statement was obtained, claiming the document spoke for itself. After a 3-week trial, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. James Ellis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His mother fainted in the courtroom. James sat motionless, stunned, as the judge read his sentence. He had been failed by the very system meant to protect him. A man who had never committed a crime in his life was about to spend decades behind bars for something he didn't do. And in that moment, justice was not served. It was buried. Part 3. Life in prison is a place designed to break a person, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. For James Ellis, the first year inside was a brutal awakening. At 22, he entered Georgia's Stonewall maximum security prison, a place notorious for violence, overcrowding, and corruption. The concrete walls were stained, the air thick with sweat and despair. Inmates quickly sized up newcomers. James, soft-spoken and visibly shaken, was targeted almost immediately. He spent the first few months in protective custody after an altercation with a gang member. The guards were indifferent at best and cruel at worst. He witnessed stabbings in the mess hall, nightly beatings, and the steady decline of men who had once walked the world free but now shuffled like ghosts. James tried to keep to himself, reading old law books from the prison library and writing in a journal he kept hidden under his mattress. He maintained his innocence to anyone who would listen. Other inmates, guards, even the prison chaplain, most didn't care. Some mocked him, calling him preacher because he spoke about truth and justice. But a few believed him, including a former paralegal named Victor Ramirez, serving 25 years for armed robbery. Victor became both mentor and friend. He taught James how to navigate prison life and how to start filing motions, appeals, and information requests. James's family visited when they could, though the drive was long and the expenses difficult to bear. His mother wrote weekly letters. His younger sister, now raising children of her own, would occasionally bring them to visit. These moments, though brief, helped James cling to some fragment of hope. Over the next 10 years, James filed multiple appeals, all of which were denied. Courts upheld his conviction, citing overwhelming circumstantial evidence. His legal aid efforts hit brick wall after brick wall, yet he persisted. Every denial only strengthened his resolve. Prison took a toll on his body. He developed ulcers, back pain, and chronic insomnia. But he refused to let it take his mind. He earned his GED, then took correspondence courses in criminal justice. He spent his 30s and early 40s mentoring younger inmates, trying to steer them away from the mistakes that brought them in. Still, every night he returned to his cell, his concrete box of injustice. Every night he stared at the ceiling and whispered the same words, "I didn't see this." What James didn't know was that outside those prison walls, a stranger would soon stumble upon a letter that would change everything. Part 4. The letter. It began with a box of old documents in a dusty archive room at a nonprofit legal aid clinic in Atlanta. Olivia Chen, a second-year law student volunteering during the summer, was assigned the unglamorous task of digitizing case files from the 1990s. She worked alone in a poorly lit room, combing through yellowed papers, most of them mundane. But one afternoon, she found a thick manila folder labeled James Ellis, Fairview case. She had never heard of the case before. Curious, she skimmed through the trial transcripts, the arrest reports, and the appeals, all of which had been denied. One document in particular caught her attention, a handwritten letter dated 1994, addressed to a now-deceased defense attorney. It was from a man named Darren Brett Carpenter, an inmate at Stonewall Prison who claimed to have overheard a confession from another man who described the attack on Rebecca, Coleman in disturbingly accurate detail, and who explicitly stated that James Ellis wasn't the guy. But the letter had never been followed up on. It sat in the file, ignored for over 2 decades. Olivia's heart raced. She photocopied the letter and brought it to her supervising attorney, Marcus Lane, a former civil rights prosecutor who had spent the last decade working wrongful conviction cases. He read the letter in silence, then looked up and said, "We need to talk to this guy now." Red Carpenter had died in 2005, but the man he mentioned, a former inmate named Leon Rucker, was still alive, now living in a halfway house in Augusta. Marcus and Olivia drove 4 hours the next morning to speak with him. At first, Leon was guarded, but after some gentle pressure and a reminder that the statute of limitations on perjury had passed, Leon finally opened up. "I was young, dumb, and scared," he said, "but I remember clear as day. This dude Kenny Lowell, he was in my pod. He was bragging about what he did to that girl. Said the cops were stupid and they pinned it on some church boy who never even fought back. That's what he called James." Wyoming provided dates, details, and names, enough to build a case for further inquiry. Marcus Lane knew they needed more. But for the first time in 30 years, James Ellis's name was about to resurface, not as a convicted felon, but as a man who just might be telling the truth. Part 6. The fight for justice freedom didn't mean peace, not for James Ellis. Though he was finally a free man, he walked out of prison into a world that had changed without him. The skyline looked different. The phones were touchscreens. People barely made eye contact. And despite the cheers and headlines, James was now 52, with no job history, no income, no home of his own, and a name that had been tarnished for over 3 decades. But what James lacked in resources, he made up for in resolve. Within weeks of his release, James stood in front of a crowd at a rally in Atlanta organized by the Georgia Innocence Project. With a calm but powerful voice, he shared his story, not to gain sympathy, but to shine a light on the system that had failed him and so many others. "This isn't just about me," he told the crowd. "It's about the thousands of innocent men and women still behind bars, waiting for someone to believe them, waiting for justice." National organizations began to take notice. James was invited to speak at universities, legal symposiums, and civil rights forums. He met with lawmakers to push for legislation that would make interrogations mandatory to record, increase funding for public defenders, and require independent review panels for claims of wrongful convictions. In parallel, Marcus Lane and Olivia Chen worked with a legal team to file a civil lawsuit on James's behalf, targeting the Fairview Police Department, the prosecuting attorney's office, and the state of Georgia for misconduct, suppression of evidence, and violations of James's constitutional rights. The legal battle was arduous. Government agencies dragged their feet. Defense lawyers argued technicalities. But James was determined to see it through, not just for compensation, but for accountability. In 2023, a Georgia court awarded James Ellis a $6.5 million settlement. While it could never return the years stolen from him, it gave James the means to rebuild his life and to help others do the same. He established the Ellis Foundation for Justice, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal support, re-entry resources, and advocacy training for the wrongfully convicted. He hired Victor Ramirez, his old friend from prison who is now out on parole, to lead the re-entry program. Olivia, now a practicing attorney, joined the board. James rented a small apartment in downtown Atlanta, decorated with photos of his family, a bookshelf filled with law texts, and a single framed copy of the letter that had saved his life. Above it hung a quote he lived by now: "Truth crushed to earth shall rise again." Even as he gained national recognition, James remained humble, spending his days visiting prisons, mentoring exonerees, and pushing for systemic change. Because for James Ellis, the fight wasn't over, it had just begun. Part 5. Investigation and New Evidence. Once Marcus Lane and Olivia Chen confirmed the testimony of Leon Rucker, they knew the case needed to be reopened, but the road ahead wouldn't be easy. In wrongful conviction cases, the burden of proof isn't just to show that mistakes were made, but that those mistakes directly undermined the integrity of the original verdict. Marcus filed a formal petition with the Georgia Innocence Project, attaching the rediscovered letter, Leon's statement, and a summary of James's case history. The case was accepted, but the timeline would be grueling. Meanwhile, Olivia dove into the original crime scene files. She found troubling inconsistencies, missing evidence logs, a DNA report that had never been processed, and the name of a third-party witness, a teenage jogger named Crystal Maynard, who was never called to testify. According to an old police note, Crystal had seen someone running from the park that night, but her description didn't match James at all. In fact, it closely resembled Kenny Lowell. Olivia tracked Crystal down, now living in North Carolina. When interviewed, Crystal admitted she had told the police what she saw, but they dismissed her because she didn't get a good enough look. Yet her original statement was never presented to the defense, a potential Brady violation. More explosive was the DNA sample. With modern technology, Olivia and the Innocence Project requested the sample be retested. The results came back. The DNA found on Rebecca Coleman's torn clothing did not match James Ellis. It matched Kenny Lowell, whose DNA was now in the system due to unrelated offenses committed in the early 2000s. Armed with the new evidence, Marcus and the team filed a motion for a new trial, based on the grounds of newly discovered exculpatory evidence and suppression of witness testimony. The local DA's office initially resisted, but mounting public attention, fueled by social media and a growing campaign titled #FreeJamesLess, made it politically untenable to ignore. Media outlets began revisiting the case. National coverage brought fresh eyes and outrage. James's name was trending, and for the first time in decades, the tide was turning. A judge granted an evidentiary hearing. The case, once buried in bureaucracy and neglect, was now front-page news. Inside Stonewall Prison, James received the news in a trembling phone call. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." The hearing was scheduled. James would be transported back to the same courthouse that had sentenced him to life. But this time, he'd walk in not as a forgotten inmate, but as a man with a chance to be heard again. The courthouse buzzed with press and protesters. Olivia prepped James for days, reviewing every detail, every inconsistency, and every fact that now stood between him and freedom. When James took the stand, he didn't speak with anger. He spoke with clarity and calm. He recounted the night of the crime, the years behind bars, and the hope he never gave up on. Crystal Maynard testified, now confident and composed, reaffirming what she saw that night. The DNA analyst explained the modern testing and confirmed the match to Kenny Lowell. And the new defense team meticulously highlighted every procedural misstep made during the original trial. The judge, known for his stern demeanor, listened without interruption. At the end of 3 days of testimony, he recessed for deliberation. A week later, the ruling came. The conviction was overturned. James Ellis was exonerated. After 30 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, he was finally free. As James walked out of the courtroom, blinking into the sunlight he hadn't felt in decades, cheers erupted. Reporters crowded around him, but he paused to hug Olivia and Marcus first. "You gave me my life back," he said, but James wasn't done. He had a new mission, to make sure what happened to him would never happen to another innocent soul again. Part 7. Legacy and Impact. James Ellis's name became synonymous with justice reform. In the years following his release and the founding of the Ellis Foundation for Justice, James didn't slow down. He traveled across the country, advocating for legislative reforms that would prevent wrongful convictions, including the mandatory preservation of DNA evidence. recording of all interrogations, and the creation of conviction integrity units in every state. His work led to real, tangible change. In 2025, the Georgia State Legislature passed the Ellis Act, requiring all interrogations and felony cases to be audio and video recorded. Within 2 years, other states followed. His advocacy wasn't just words, it reshaped laws. James also launched an annual summit called the Freedom Conference, bringing together exonerees, attorneys, journalists, and law students. The conference became a national platform to share stories, spark reforms, and build alliances across justice sectors. Documentaries were made, books were written. High schools and colleges studied his case as part of their curriculum. One film, Buried Truths, The James Ellis Story, was nominated for an Emmy and used in legal education programs nationwide. But perhaps the most powerful testament to his impact was the people. In just 5 years, the Ellis Foundation helped overturn 17 wrongful convictions. Dozens of exonerees were reunited with their families, and hundreds more received transitional services that helped them reintegrate into society with dignity and hope. James also funded scholarships for at-risk youth interested in studying law, criminal justice, and social advocacy. He mentored many of them personally, offering a blend of wisdom, lived experience, and unwavering belief in second chances. In 2030, at age 63, James Ellis received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Standing on the White House lawn, surrounded by his legal team, friends, and the families of the innocent he helped free, he gave a short, emotional speech. "I lost 30 years, but I didn't lose my purpose. Injustice stole my freedom, but truth gave me a mission. Let this medal remind us all, justice isn't just a goal, it's a responsibility." Even after national recognition, James continued his work at a grassroots level. He visited prisons, comforted grieving families, and spoke truth to power. To him, the work was never about headlines. It was about people. James passed away peacefully in 2042 at the age of 75. His funeral was attended by thousands, from former inmates and governors to students and strangers who had been touched by his story. The city of Atlanta declared April 3rd as James Ellis Day. His legacy lives on in every law school that teaches his case, in every exoneree who walks free, and in every young lawyer who believes that justice is more than a verdict. It is a promise. Part 8, A Movement Beyond One Man. Though James Ellis's life had come to a peaceful end, the ripple effects of his story continued to grow. By 2045, the Ellis Foundation had expanded nationally, establishing legal aid chapters in 38 states and collaborating with law schools to provide pro bono representation for inmates with claims of innocence. Thousands of law students were now trained annually through the Ellis Legal Justice Fellowship, a program rooted in James' vision that the next generation would be better, smarter, and more relentless in the pursuit of justice. In 2047, the U.S. Department of Justice released a landmark report inspired by James's case. It detailed systemic flaws in eyewitness testimony procedures, forensic evidence reliability, and prosecutorial immunity. The report became the basis for sweeping federal reform, including the Justice Integrity Act, which provided federal grants to local jurisdictions, committed to reviewing past convictions and implementing new accountability measures. James's story became a case study not just for the courts, but for culture. His name appeared in music, literature, and even children's books, where his perseverance and integrity became symbols of strength against adversity. A biopic released in 2049, starring a major actor and directed by an award-winning filmmaker, introduced his story to a global audience. But beyond the headlines and accolades, the real impact was personal. Letters poured into the Ellis Foundation every week from men and women behind bars, each line filled with hope. "James gave me strength to keep going. A group of former exonerees, all helped by the foundation, formed a grassroots movement called Truth Unchained, which organized state-level protests, education campaigns, and public forums to keep wrongful conviction in the national spotlight. In 2052, the city of Atlanta broke ground on the James Ellis Institute for Justice, a multi-purpose legal center offering education, legal services, and mental health resources for the wrongfully convicted and their families. The institute opened on April 3rd, James Ellis Day. As one of the speakers at the opening, Victor Ramirez, James's former cellmate and now the institute's director, captured the legacy best. He gave us more than hope. He gave us a mission. This place isn't just made of bricks and glass. It's built from truth, resilience, and a promise to never look away again. What began as a miscarriage of justice had become a movement of truth, proving that one man's pain could lead to a nation's transformation. And so, James Ellis's story didn't end in a prison cell or even at a memorial. It lives on, in every law challenged, every case re-examined, and every innocent life finally set free. Part 9. Global Awakening. James Ellis' story sparked change across the United States, but it didn't just stop at the border. In 2053, an international human rights summit in The Hague cited James' case as a prime example of systemic failure in modern justice systems. Delegates from over 60 countries participated in discussions that led to the formation of a new global initiative, the International Justice Resilience Network, IJRN, a coalition of nonprofits, legal experts, and government advisors dedicated to reviewing and overturning wrongful convictions worldwide. Within 2 years, the IJRN launched pilot programs in South Africa, Brazil, India, and the United Kingdom. These programs offered case reviews, forensic reevaluations, and cross-border legal training. The Ellis Foundation became one of its lead advisors, helping shape protocols and developing technology-assisted methods to detect false confessions and flawed trials. By 2056, the organization had helped exonerate over 2,000 individuals worldwide. In Paris, a large mural appeared on the side of a courthouse, a painted tribute to James Ellis, alongside the word "Verit," truth. In Sao Paulo, law students organized the first annual Ellis Legal Ethics Conference. And in Lagos, a tech startup named Elisai used AI-driven review systems to analyze old court transcripts for signs of bias or judicial misconduct. Back in Atlanta, James's niece, Maya Ellis, had become a prominent civil rights attorney, continuing his mission on a global scale. Fluent in 3 languages and often traveling between continents, Maya became the voice of a generation demanding not just justice, but fairness, and not just in America, but everywhere. The Ellis Foundation partnered with filmmakers to release a follow-up documentary series, Beyond Justice, The Global Fight, which trended worldwide and brought untold stories from war-torn and unjust regions to light. James's story was no longer just a tragedy turned triumph. It was a beacon, a bridge, a battle cry. The man who was once silenced by the system had become a global symbol of resilience. Part 10. Reflection and Call to Action. James Ellis. A story is a reminder that the pursuit of justice is never a finished chapter, is an ongoing obligation for every society that claims to be free and fair. In a world where wrongful convictions still occur and where countless innocent individuals sit behind bars, the question isn't just what went wrong, it is what we're willing to do to make it right. James didn't live to see every part of the system reformed. He didn't get to witness the global movement that arose from his struggle, but his story has become a mirror for us all, of a justice system in need of repair, of lives forever altered by a single mistake, and of the extraordinary resilience of one man who refused to be forgotten. Now it's your turn. Support local and national innocence projects. Push for transparency and accountability in your community's legal system. Educate yourself about the signs of systemic bias. And most importantly, when you hear a story that doesn't sound right, listen harder. Believe the unbelievable. Ask questions, demand answers. Because justice is not just the responsibility of courts or lawyers, it belongs to all of us. Let James Ellis's legacy be more than memory. Let it be momentum. Let it be the reason another innocent life is saved.